You're listening to LangFM, the podcast about language and what people do with it. My guest on this episode, fellow Alexander and former fellow conference interpreter at the European Commission.
I'm just a poor boy from another nowhere town.
Alexander Smith.
Just a nowhere boy from another nowhere town.
That's him singing, by the way.
Must be a way whereby God can know my name.
In 2017, Alex hung up his interpreting headphones for good. I jumped at the chance to sit down with him for a chat about his life in interpreting and in music. So here he is, the wonderful Alexander Smith.
Than the hair upon my head. Love is closer than the thought inside my head.
My father was a Scotsman and my mother was Danish. I was born in Fontainebleau in France because my father was stationed there with the RAF, in the early 50s. We were in Singapore for a while because there was still an empire in those days, for which it seems there's much nostalgia,
Oh yeah, these days there is.
And then we went back to London. My father worked at Air Ministry, and we lived in Ealing in London. And then when my father retired from the Air Force, he worked for GCHQ, the intelligence people. That was in Cheltenham. So we moved to Cheltenham, and I went to school in Cheltenham there. Then as I left school, which was, 1969, my father retired from GCHQ and went to live in Scotland, in Carnoustie, which is near Dundee. And I then went away to university in Newcastle on Tyne in the north of England. So it was a bit of a change there.
So how did your parents meet? Did your mother work at an army base?
No, not at all. I don't know. I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but my father was working in Copenhagen after the war, building up civil aviation at Kastrup, And I think he asked directions of my mother, I think at the station, and said, do you speak English? Where she said, a little. Because my mother must have been quite interested, because she said, but you must meet my father, who does speak quite good English, who studied it. So my father went through this ritual of sort of, entertaining her, my grandfather. But he was obviously a lot more interested in my mother than he was in
fair enough. You went to the trouble, That's good.
And so, eventually, one thing led to another, and they were married, And that must have been 1951. And then I was born in 52,
and did you speak the respective languages with your parents, English and Danish, or
not really? Because my mother made a big effort when I was very little to speak Danish to me. But as soon as I went to school, and don't forget in England you went to school at age 4.5, 5, I really didn't want to know, because I wanted to be just as cool as those other monolingual kids. Yeah. And of course the idea that my mother was some sort of weirdo, who didn't speak proper, it used to embarrass me at that age. Well, now I feel embarrassed at the fact of having been embarrassed. But you know how it is with kids, the pull of conformity is huge. Infinity.
But I'm tied up here in your little box, yeah. I'm okay, you're okay, this is...
We used to go to Denmark every year on a holiday as well. So I kind of knew Denmark. I had a feel for Denmark in a childish sort of way. I had a complete. I also had an echo of the language, as a sort of corporeal experience. So for me, when I came to learning Danish, when I went to university, I went to study Scandinavian studies. Of course, it was miles easier for me to learn it than for people coming from it scratch, because I already had a feel for it. You know what I mean? It wasn't really a foreign language, because the whole vibration of it, the whole emotional state which attaches to speaking another language, was something which was completely familiar to me. So it was a lot easier for me to learn than than for others, because I know that interpreters, for example, coming to Danish find it very hard.
Oh, yeah.
Not because Danish is intrinsically hard. It's probably...
Well, except the numbers.
It's probably
so
yeah, it's probably the easiest language. It's probably the language which is actually closest to English, in fact,
Okay, yeah.
I mean, other than French, but that's because, English is full of French. But
Yes,
actually, if you look at it,
yeah.
I mean, Danish is probably the language which is closest to English, which is hardly surprising because it's obviously influenced English,
Yeah.
But of course, acoustically, it's really, really tricky because it's very, very difficult to get used to the sound of it and the pronunciation of it, which was never really a problem for me. So I had a bit of a flying start with that. I had quite a good command of the most base and vulgar Danish imaginable. In fact,
What they call kitchen Danish.
well, it was less than that. It was below that.
Yeah.
Although, ironically, I did work in the hospital kitchen, but it was pretty sort of vulgar, really.
I see.
I mean, I think Danish is like German. There's a coarse streak to the language which is incredibly coarse.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But it was kind of fun. I know we used to tease my mother, who had pretensions of gentility. My brother and I. My brother also drank from the same spring. So we used to speak to each other in this absolutely sort of base Copenhagen accent. To my
Is he younger brother or older brother?
He's younger than me.
brother,
And it used to irritate my mother no end, of course, which we found it extremely amusing, So I was.
So there was no way you were going to become a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer,
Well,
whatever.
I don't forget, I come from another planet. It's another era altogether, because I was brought up I was at school in the 60s, and the idea that you would never get a job was just, it was unthinkable. Of course you would get a job, I went to a nice school, a nice middle-class background. I was bound to get a job of some sort. There was no thought of that. So in a way, we were much freer. I mean, the thing I was best at school was languages, which interested me most. And I was interested in learning Danish for the simple reason I had a whole bunch of Danish family I couldn't speak to properly, Yeah. And my father, who through his work at GCHQ, he actually said to me, look, I wouldn't hesitate to learn a one-off language. He said, because you find you might be the only person who does it.
Yeah.
And because most of us, and I went to university, and my contemporaries said, "What the bloody hell are you learning Danish for? Everyone speaks bloody English. It's a complete waste of time."
Oh, even back then, yeah.
Yeah, and the Danes certainly already then were, would and could speak English.
Yeah.
But I mean, as it turned out, I got my job here on the strength of the Danish, which was because they were desperate for people who knew Danish, And so my father's advice came out trumps, absolutely, So it just goes to show. I mean, you don't really know, really. I mean, it seems to make a lot of sense to learn the standard languages. Yeah. In my day, at least, the standard languages were French and German.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, German is being pushed aside by Spanish now as a second language because, people go on holiday to Spain or
retire in Spain.
People say it's easier or so, which I don't believe, actually. No. But, I mean, there's no such thing as an easy language. I mean, that's just absurd, So I regret that because I really enjoyed studying German at school. We learned French from the earliest age.
So no classics then?
Oh, I did Latin. Obviously, I did Latin throughout.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you had to, I suppose.
But I've forgotten everything. I mean, I can't even read an inscription. I mean, I can sort of deduce it from Italian and French, but I can't really read Latin. But we did Latin. Around the clock. I also studied Greek for a while, classical Greek, so I could read it. I can't understand it, but I can read it.
At least you can read it.
Yes. And even the French was studied in a very, very old-fashioned way. I mean, it was studied almost in the same way as a dead language.
Yeah, because it was much more difficult to travel. I mean, in those days, I imagine.
We had a school trip to France. I remember as something quite magical because we were twinned with a school in La Flèche, which is on Le Loire. It's down that way near La Loire. And it was called La Prytanée Militaire de la Flèche. My school, which was rather pompous, self-important establishment, had saw itself as having a sort of military aspect to it. Yeah. And this Prytanée Militaire was actually a school specially for the children of serving officers and so on. So we were jumelé with them, and I remember going there and thinking it was just absolutely marvellous. But the whole business of foreignness and foreign languages is always absolutely incredibly intriguing, incredibly exciting to me. I mean, I don't know how you could not be fascinated by it.
I completely agree, yes.
You know. And, then I went on, when at school, the 3 subjects which I took, for leaving school were English, French and German. And then I left school and I went to the university in Newcastle there, where they had a big Scandinavian studies department, because of the natural links with Scandinavia. They had a big Scandinavian department there, and I was very pleased to go there. And it was great, because I was very spoilt as well, because they had a whole Scandinavian department, and they didn't have that many students. So we went. And in fact, in final honours Danish, there was me and another guy who was a mature student who was about 10 years older than me, who'd married a Danish girl, And so it was just the two of us. So it was like, it must be like being an only child in China or something. We were incredibly. The whole department was completely devoted to us,
which is fantastic.
Yeah,
of course.
absolutely. When you think of the fact that the Scandinavians ruled much of England, and there's a huge influence there. I mean, it makes perfect sense, really, from a language history point of view. I know, for example, people who study the history of English seriously, not only study Anglo-Saxon but also study Old Icelandic. So, I mean, which is something I studied too, incidentally, at university. Part of my course involved the study of Old Icelandic. But that was literally like Latin, because it's contrary to Danish, which has become very simplified. It's highly inflected, there's conjugations and declensions, a go-go, So we had to learn all of those things, but of which, of course, I can remember not a thing. I mean, I went on mission to Iceland a few years ago, and I was really excited at that, But I was very disappointed to discover I really couldn't understand it, and I couldn't really even read a newspaper. I mean, I could read a newspaper in languages I don't really know, like Italian and Spanish.
But, could you read the script? Because the script already is quite interesting.
Oh, no. Well, they have a few letters which are slightly different. I recognise those letters, There's a th and th. But, I mean, no, I can recognise the letters, but it's just that, I was surprised that I didn't understand more,
But what was the plan? I mean, did you have a plan studying and then moving on to...
Well, no. I mean, in fact, I was very interested in doing a number of research projects which I had in mind. There's one
linguistic research?
Linguistic history projects I had in mind, because I was very interested in the links between Denmark and Scotland because of my parents, and there's very interesting historical links there. I was certainly interested in place names, for example, which is quite fascinating. Because
it is.
Not only do you have Scandinavian place names, which in England, but in Scotland, even in the Gaelic-speaking areas, you have Scandinavian place names. So there's a quite clear influence of Scandinavian on the Gaelic-speaking regions as well, which is quite intriguing, And then, of course, you have Orkney and Shetland, which were very specifically Scandinavian. So I was very interested in researching those dialects in order to be able to trace the exact Scandinavian origin of all of that. As a sort of fill-in job, I got a job in a hospital. It was an old people's home in Copenhagen. And, that was piles of fun, because I was in with a lot of young people. It was, the early 70s, and it was just an absolute gas, And I used to work there do the Sunday shift sometimes. And I remember they had a little garden there, and I was just kicking my heels a bit in this garden. There was a Sunday newspaper, and I never used to get the Danish Sunday newspaper because, there were massive, great things. I could never get through them. They were quite expensive for me then. But no one seemed to want this paper, so I purloined it and took it home, and I was reading it. There was a little article which said, Dansk et probleembarn for EF. Danish is a problem for the European communities because they couldn't find people, and there was a whole.
So this was in the run-up to the
this was
joining the EU.
This was just after. It must have been.
After, yeah.
It was just after I graduated, and I just went back to the job which I'd had as a student when I had been in Denmark because I enjoyed it so much. So all this little article which said that Danish was a problem for the EU, and there were the whole of it was before the interpretation service was trying to recruit people. They were holding a meeting at the information centre in Copenhagen, and I thought, well, I might as well turn up and see what it is. And I came straight from work. I had a shift which ran from 6 o'clock in the morning till 2 o'clock, and this was in the afternoon. So I came straight from work, and you got to realise it was 1974. It was still flared trousers and long hair, and I turned up there, and of course I thought, oh my God, everyone's wearing suits. This is a serious. It wasn't just a sort of casual inquiry. It was a serious,
serious event.
A serious event. Anyway, when I just ploughed ahead with it, they gave us what I subsequently realised was an aptitude test. And the guy spoke to me in Danish for a bit, and he said, well, could you repeat that? Well, yeah, that was easy. I just had to repeat what he said. It's quite obvious. Then they asked me to do some French, and my French wasn't really up to much.
So he spoke Danish or English?
The guy spoke a bit of Danish, and I had to I took a few notes, like an aptitude test, and I gave it back. But it was dead easy. I mean, there was no issue really.
Came naturally.
I didn't really. And then I had to do some French, which I didn't know the words so well, so I immediately started lying. So I had all the rights and conservative instincts, and I managed to get through that. And then I realised subsequently the guy who gave me the interview was Flöschner, and Flöschner said, well, if you come down to Brussels and do the stage there, you'll pick up a lot of French. That'll be fine. Start in November, which was just the next month, really.
Wow.
And so I came down to do the stage in November of 1974.
So moving to Brussels wasn't a big problem at all?
Well, I was really young. I was only 22. I mean, the whole thing was just like, don't forget, it was a different kind of era where it was like, I was thinking I was just going to be just another cool thing I was going to do in this fabulous swathe. I was going to be cutting through life, So I kind of rocked up in Brussels, blundered my way through the various offices, and then went and did the course, completely protected by my innocence, and
it's a good thing, maybe.
Yeah. And then we got a bit of a rude awakening with the stage because it was based on the old French idea of intimidating people,
breaking you, as you would say.
But I mean, I've been doing exams, forever. So I was quite used to doing exams. It didn't really worry me too much, but it was quite tough. You had to do a test every. It was a 6-month course. You had to do a test every 2 months.
Yeah.
And then I passed the final test. It must have been at the end of April 75, and then I started work as an auxiliaire, as it was in those days, in May of 1975. I finished the stage. I wasn't. I went over to England in just before Christmas. Right. Just after Christmas, we were married in 74. Then I brought my wife over with me. The period we finished the stage. And then I started work in 75. We moved into a swanky apartment on the strength of my fantastic salary.
So they didn't manage to break you after all. You were successful in the final exam.
No, I mean, I as I say, I think I was protected by my innocence because when it came to taking exams later on, I found them much more intimidating because I I knew the people, I knew what was going on. I mean, because don't forget, I mean, I didn't really think I was going to stay. I mean, I just thought, we'll do this,
See how it goes.
Yeah, and don't forget, it was before there was any idea of a crisis or anything. Yeah. There was a sort of oil crisis in 73, wasn't there? And that was the beginning of the end of the halcyon days of where, no one worried about stuff like that. We were incredibly free when I think about it, Yeah. But, after that, things got tougher. And then it went through to the 80s where you got a whole new kind of Thatcherite generation who were much more kind of structured in what they wanted to do, We still had a kind of slightly amateur approach. I think we were better for it. I mean, some of the interpreters I knew were absolutely brilliant. I don't think I've ever come across anyone like Tony Bradley was absolutely brilliant. Richard Appleby, who died very sadly, was absolutely brilliant interpreter. And they were part of that generation where they didn't decide at the age, some tender age, of what they wanted to be when they grew up was to be interpreters. They just happened to know the languages and happened to be good at it.
And then interpreting happened to them.
Exactly, absolutely.
But you did pick up French then when you stayed in Brussels?
Oh, yes. Yeah. French I had studied. I mean, I'd studied it at university. It's just that, I'd forgotten it. And, it's one of those things, if you don't practice it, you lose it. And it had been completely overlaid by my Danish because I'd thrown myself into this Danish thing, which I think psychologically played a very important role in my life because it gave me a kind of an alternative identity. Because, I went to this rather self-important school in that slightly kind of constipated environment of English sort of, that English world which is sufficient unto itself,
Good stuff,
And I was able to sort of reinvent myself really now, I think a lot of people do that when they study language. They discover it's a medium for kind of reinventing themselves through the medium of a different language, a different culture, I think it's a fantastic opportunity. Of course, as a result of which you see the world completely differently. Other people may do things differently, but though it's different, it's equally valid.
But how would you say interpreting was different back then? It's maybe a lazy question, but it's still, I think, interesting. Well, there were fewer languages first.
There were fewer languages, and it was smaller, and people knew each other much more. It was much more much more intimate.
For the delegates and the interpreters? Was there more contact between the two than there is nowadays? What did you mean among the interpreters?
Yeah, we didn't. I don't remember socializing as such with the delegates, but of course they were easier to see. Yeah. You could establish eye contact much more. The whole thing was much more intimate, Whereas now, if you're working in the English booth, you're working for all and sundry. It's difficult to have quite that same sort of, intuitive umbilical link to the delegation, which we had when we started. Of course, the other huge difference is English, isn't it? Because in our day, French
was very much a foreign language.
French was far and away the dominant language, So we did acres and acres of French, including a lot of really bad French, like you guys have to do piles of bad English, So, we had to do...
It doesn't repeat itself, after all.
But, I think from a professional point of view, we were far better off because, for starters, an auxiliaire, as I started, you worked every day for a year, and then I took another test and became a temporaire, and I worked every day, and you actually worked every day, and we were two in the booth. So you work. So that's a deep sort of instinct for it, that's simply the moving sort of centre aspect of it was inculcated in us from the earliest times. So I think we had a huge advantage, from that point of view.
Because there's lots of routine.
Absolutely. Yeah. You couldn't do it if it weren't for routine. It'd be impossible. Imagine having to reinvent the wheel.
How did you go about adding more languages? Was it just out of curiosity? Were you told to learn?
No, not really. But I always felt duty-bound to add German because I'd studied German at school, and I'd always liked German. I really enjoyed reading German literature and stuff, but my German was a bit iffy. And I, of course, it was difficult for me to go away to study, because I would have liked to have gone, I don't know, to Heidelberg or something and study, but I couldn't actually do that because by that time, we had small children and that it wasn't really practicable. So I never got the chance to go away, but I studied it a lot, reading and listening and watching TV and stuff for myself. And then I ended up taking a test. I asked them to give me a test because I really wanted to get the driving license. I didn't have to do the test, but I wanted to feel that it wasn't just my responsibility, Yeah. And funny enough, it was Tony Bradley who was the person at my test there. And Tony said, well, it sounded very convincing. I'm not quite sure whether it was exactly what the original said, but it's very difficult sometimes to compare. So he kind of saw right through me. But German was a challenge, I must say. I found it, quite. I get avalanched occasionally, by it. But now, I mean, the word order thing I hardly notice. I know it sounds ridiculous because people say, the word order must be really difficult. But I don't notice it because you get so used to the rhythms of the language that, I mean, it's a completely. Not as though Germans, bust the gut putting their verbs at the end of the sentence. It's a perfectly normal and natural thing,
And you learn to anticipate and, know what the speaker's
Of course,
going,
because thankfully no one's terribly original, you know what I mean? Of course, how can they be if everyone's learned language by copying it? So, I mean, so once you get in the natural cadences of the language.
Is that something that you notice increasingly, that people aren't really original, that topics keep popping up, that people tend to say the same thing?
Well, yes, I think so, isn't it? I mean, obviously there are subjects which you know less about, but gradually, simply by dint of doing them, you become more familiar with them. I mean, you know perfectly well. It's not as though you're even remotely an expert, but certain things, keep coming round, and you get used to them. I often think that about language. You don't really learn languages; you just get used to them, really, don't you?
Yeah. So which other languages did you add to?
Then after that,
Quiver.
I added Swedish, and that was at the specific request of the head of booth at the time, who was Tony Bradley.
So that was for the Swedish.
Not Tony Bradley, Tony Scott.
Tony Scott, yeah.
And Tony rang me up just out at a meet, and I was at a meeting one day. And said, we want you to learn Norwegian or Swedish?"
Yes.
He said at the time, and. I said, I think I prefer to do Swedish for the simple reason it's more different,
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And and that was it. And I did a course here. I was with a bunch of Danes, actually, mostly. We went up to Sweden for a couple of weeks. And then it's like it's like preparing people for the front when you're running out of recruits. You know what I mean?
Get them ready.
We got 2 weeks of bayonet practice and got sent to the front. But I mean, no, that was a real challenge to start with. Again, I got very used to doing Swedish. In a way, I mean. They're in a way that it's culturally different from Denmark, and they have a culture of public speaking, and so often they're, as it were, objectively speaking, better speakers. And so sometimes I've found actually the Swedish easier to do than the Danish. Although I understand, I mean, if I were drunk and you kicked me awake or something, I could understand Danish. But, Swedish, other people's conversations are still a bit, comme ci, comme ça. But, I mean, I got a lot of fun out of doing the Swedish also because I studied Scandinavian studies. And it's one of those things I'd always meant to do.
So you had a very good foundation, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, Danish gives you kind of a running start because, obviously a lot of the words are, if not the same, at least equivalent, But there's a lot of different words. There are faux amis, and the way they say things, the way they put their thoughts together is actually quite different, And you've got to learn that a whole new kind of emotional furniture which goes with a new language, But no, I got a lot of fun out of that, and I think one of the things I really enjoyed was overcoming the typically Danish prejudices about Sweden, which is basically that Siberia starts in Helsingborg, You know what I mean? Which is, quite radically unfair. And I enjoyed Sweden hugely, and now, actually, I've been to Sweden a few times on holiday with my wife. My wife actually prefers Stockholm to Copenhagen. Well, I suppose it is, in a way, quite breathtakingly beautiful city. I mean, it doesn't have quite the same urban buzz as Copenhagen has, but it's a classic beauty as opposed to a joli laide, which is But no. So I mean, I got a lot out of the Swedish, and then in the end, I sort of came clean and felt I really ought to sort of work on the Dutch because I'd lived here all these years. Yeah. And in meetings I understood a significant percentage of what was said, and then I got to the point where I thought it was almost better for me to do it direct than to take the relay.
Yeah.
And so I said I'd do it, and they sent me to. Well, I went to KUL in Leuven. I could stay at home with the family.
Yeah,
I went
just
to
around the corner.
I went to the KUL every day for 3 months, and I just filled my day with an assortment of lectures. And then I came back and did it. So that was the Dutch, and then of course I added Norwegian just for a sort of boyish desire to have a complete set of Scandinavian names. I did Norwegian very much on the cheap because I said they didn't want to pay for any sort of course for me. I said, well, just send me to Norway for a week. And I went to the university in Oslo for a week and did exactly the same thing. I went to lectures every day for a week and tried to sort of simply,
soak it up.
And then I've done it. The most fun Norwegian meeting I did was the ETUC Congress a couple of years ago in Paris, where suddenly realizing. They started nervously speaking Norwegian. When they realised it was kind of working, they all suddenly popped out of the woodwork. I mean, they hunted packs, So I got quite a lot of quite scary Norwegian. But what they do have, which is more tricky, is they have a sort of respect for dialect. They don't. That's to say, it's not seen as being poor form to speak dialect. So, which it is, certainly in English or other languages. Come to a meeting and speak dialect is a bit sort of not really quite the thing, is it? But in Norwegian, the dialect enjoys a considerable status. You can get people speaking. God, blimey, I wasn't ready for that. I don't know if you do work from Dutch, but sometimes you get people speaking in dialect in a Flemish dialect, which leaves you gasping. And they don't realise really because
if it's in agriculture or trade unions, for example. Yes.
So that could leave you gasping. It's a little bit like that with Norwegian, because if they speak at the more formal it is, the easier it is, because the more like Danish it is, really, Knowing Danish is a bonus, but it's also a handicap because the idea that Norwegian is like some sort of subprime version of Danish is ridiculous, because it's its own world and its own raison d'être, its own way of being and its own emotional states which go with it, which are different. It's always but you know what it's like sometimes. People are not used to interpretation, get quite excited about it, don't they?
Yes. Okay.
And so they would get quite excited about it and say, hey, I've got to speak Norwegian now. It's quite
see how good the interpreter.
Yeah, well, a lot of checking goes on, but I'm an old dog. I know how to cover my tracks.
I'd like to talk about music a little bit.
Go on then.
I could just ask, how did you get into music? But I mean, did you grow up in a musical family? Were your parents?
Well, my father played a bit. He played the piano a bit,
But more as a general skill that many people had, or
well, no, I was sent to piano lessons, because
that's what people
I came from a nice middle class home, and
that's what I mean. Yeah.
That's what you did, and I went to the Ismar Govet School of Pianoforte in Ealing, and I was a poor piano student, really. Because
your heart wasn't in it.
Well, it's not that I was. I never got. I always liked it. I just never got around to practicing for whatever reasons of laziness, distraction.
Same here.
And then I used to go down there. And I have my knuckles rapped by the piano teacher. You haven't practiced. You haven't touched the piano once this week, have you, Alex? Don't just look down and shrug.
Yeah,
but
I've been there.
But I mean, also because I always had a good ear, so instead of reading the notes properly, I used to copy what she played as well, which is quite nice in one way. But it means, my sight reading is abysmal, and still is, But then, with adolescence, I must have been about 16 when I discovered. Don't forget, when I was 16. That was 1967. I mean, it was like the apotheosis of the rock and roll century. You know what I mean? And I got really into blues. Then I started learning to play the blues for myself.
That was still on the piano then. Right?
That was still on the piano, and I had a Memphis Slim album for all you blues aficionados out there, which I virtually copied off the record.
Yeah.
In those days, there weren't any of the modern age. You simply had to put it on the turntable and listen to it, take it off, play it, put it on the turntable.
Try again.
to the point, and I was doing those sort of boogie woogie shapes with my left hand to my parents' distraction, to the point where they actually locked the piano to prevent me playing it. So, most parents are very, very keen that their children should take an interest in music. But it got to the point where my parents really couldn't bear it any longer. It used to sort of limit my playing of boogie woogie bass shapes to certain hours of the day.
So it was more because of it was not because it was blues and they thought that wasn't a good style of music.
No, I don't know. Although my dad used to say, "Why didn't you play something with a melody instead of that vamp?"
Yeah.
But I don't think they were ideologically opposed to it as such. It's just that it was just really, really tiresome to listen to after a while. Yeah. But so I was able to play a pretty decent sort of boogie, a few standard things. I played quite decently boogie woogie piano. I went away to university. There was a piano there, in the students' union. I used to play there. People used to come up to me and say, "Hey, do you want to join my band?" In those days,
I was going to ask about that. If you played in any ensembles,
and I said no, because in those days I was very into mountaineering and climbing, and most of my weekends were taken up sort of going to the Lake District, going up to Scotland, Northumberland, going climbing and hiking and stuff like that. So I said no, which was a shame really, because I don't know what ever happened to those bands that were formed at Newcastle University then. But some of them may be famous now, but I mean, I let it pass me by.
You missed out on that.
Yes. There was a couple of other people. And we formed a little band, which was, when I think back, it was absolutely awful. We were useless, But I mean, I fronted the band, and by then I was playing the harmonica as well, because actually it was while I was in Denmark. Actually, there was another guy turned up at this hospital where I worked. It was an English guy whose mother was Danish, so we had a similar background.
Yeah, and
he was an ex-art student. He was a bit more sort of radically alternative than I was. A guy called Stephen Goodfellow, and he could play blues harmonica. And I always played the harmonica a bit because my father had given me a harmonica for my birthday once, and I played it. But I only played kind of Scottish type tunes, and I hadn't learned. I hadn't really learned to play the blues style, which of course normal mouth organ playing is based on blowing. Whereas blues is based upon sucking. And of course, once I learnt that, of course, there was no holding me back, because it was just absolutely tremendous.
And that went off,
And of course, I mean, there was a wonderful thing for showing off to girls and stuff like that, I mean,
Mick Jagger does it to great effect, until this very day.
Yeah, well, really, it's about time he grew out of that nonsense. But, so, I mean, in the end, I fronted this band on harmonica. And anyway, it went on from there, gradually. I always played. I played with different people in different combinations. I got a Fender Rhodes piano, and I started writing my own songs. And then we recorded some songs. I did a little single back in, it must have been 79, 80. And then on from there, really. And then I wrote more and more songs. And I played in different bands and stuff. And it became the most natural thing in the world, So,
but you never pursued a professional or semi-professional career?
Well, I don't think it's not really a good bet, music, is it?
No.
I mean, I had this job here, which was just, which I always enjoyed, which I never had to bust a gut. It paid all the bills and some. And I got to travel. And I mean, that's a genuine and sincere love is his language. So, I mean, to spend your life, doing something you love and it paying the bills is really the definition of happiness, really, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
That's what what's his name? The guy who just died recently, Tom Petty said. And I couldn't agree more. And music. I made a couple of albums which I think are absolutely of decent professional quality.
They are, I can vouch for that.
But I tried marketing them a little bit, but I don't think they ever really. I think it's a bit of a niche, really, and I don't think
it takes a lot of work marketing that and doing it, even just semi-professionally. I think it's
it's a full-time job, and it's not even a job I'm very good at.
Same here.
So I mean, marketing yourself is very awkward. I think as well as psychologically is very awkward. Say, hey, I listen to me, I'm great. I mean, I've never been very good at that. It may be just false modesty or something. But I mean, I've always found that very, very awkward. But anyway, I mean, I've been then more recently. Andy Upton recruited me to Bahorn, the folk group.
There was a beekeeper who lived in Fife, and he has gotten a gentle wife. I willy willy had you
because I had a whole background in folk music. Because again, when I was a young man, I my first ever job, I bought an accordion. Don't forget, I was actually brought up on Scottish music because my father was a Scotsman, and so I got this accordion to play basically Scottish country dance music. So I'm kind of steeped in that stuff. And when I was recruited to play in Bahorn, of course, it opened up a whole new world of songwriting in a folk genre, which I've got a huge amount of fun on. I think that's my real strength is songwriting. I mean, at the risk of sounding self-important, I think I'm quite a good songwriter. I'm an okay musician, but compared to real musicians, I'm pretty sort of average. But people say, "Wow, you're great," but I know deep down I'm okay.
You're not a virtuoso, but you don't have to be.
No,
it's fine.
Well, no. Yeah. Well, that's another very interesting thing. I mean, virtuoso. I mean, I think the thing is, what touches people, I think, is songs.
Yeah.
I don't think people are impressed by a virtuoso performance.
Fast fingers, for example.
But I really think what touches people is something completely different, which is a song, and that's something which interests me far, far more, you know. And I'd rather spend my time, working on songwriting than, going through all the shapes of my fingers till I'm blue in the face.
Exercising scales.
Yeah, you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
And so that's what I've been doing. I've been doing a lot of work with folk songs. In fact, now that I've retired, I'm spreading my wings a bit because I've got another group going. Elixir, it's called.
Yeah,
it keeps you young. That's the idea, And I'm doing because there's some things which it's difficult to do with Bahorn because Bahorn's good at certain types of things.
It's a particular
but the thing that I want to do is more a kind of crossover between blues and folk, altogether a bit more syncopated, a bit funkier. And I'm trying to get together a group of people to play that stuff for me with the hope of doing an album, which would be quite nice, And then I've got my old rock and roll band, About Time too, So it's not that easy to get these people together, but we're still the best of friends. And I think they would recognise that, between us we did some fantastic work on those albums.
Yeah.
And I think I'm so pleased that they are as proud of it as I am, really, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm okay, you're okay, that's all you got to say, girl. If I had my way, you would just go away. Out there in dreamyland, you think that I'm the man who is your biggest fan, some kind of Peter Pan. The universe is expanding, infinity and infinity.
Got to be careful because I don't want to spread myself too thin either. You
still want to enjoy,
Well, I mean, as I say, I really used to think people were just, whistling in the dark when they said, "Oh, you wonder how you ever had time to work." Well, that's exactly what's happened, really. For example, now when I've finished with you, I'm off to a sculpture class which I've taken up, which enables me to sort of pursue some artistic fantasies I had, and that thing is growing, hugely, because I managed to, by mouthing off to the teacher, I've got him, enthused in my project, which means I'm kind of stuck with it now,
Have to deliver.
In fact, that's the only, being somebody who by nature is actually very idle, the only way I can get anything done is by shooting my mouth off and then finding I'm committed, because the alternative is a total loss of face, really.
Yeah, exactly. But that works for me as well. Yeah, exactly. So you actually find that you're not falling into a deep black hole after retirement. Because they offer training as well for people who are about to retire.
No, I followed that. I followed that. And
I think you have to even. I think it's mandatory.
I followed that, and then it was quite interesting. But so far, I feel actually like it's a whole new lease of life. The only thing which is different is that, I mean, when you're young, your future compensates for current inadequacies, doesn't it? Whereas now I don't really, I don't really have that sort of money in the bank anymore. You know? But I mean. No, I hope to be able to do some really interesting things. And I think the thing to do is, I mean, it's one of those things which is very easy to say, but enjoy it now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because, I mean, when I think back to my life in music, much of the time is spent on projections into the future. When we've got this, when we've done that, then this will be that and that. Yeah. But you spend a whole lifetime like that, and you kind of miss your life, really, Yeah. So, I mean, what I'm trying to do is concentrate now is on, enjoying it for what it is now. We had a Bahorn rehearsal last night, for example, and we came up with some great ideas. We had a great laugh together, and that in and of itself is an end and a purpose,
And that's the great thing about making music with other people. These coming up with things together.
Absolutely, absolutely, because But I don't know, I think it's like conversation. How often have you come up with an idea in conversation which you'd never thought of before?
Yeah.
Well, you sat there, in your own little box, I mean, the same things keep coming around. But when you have the stimulus of other people, suddenly something comes around you never realised you'd thought before. I mean, that's really, in fact, the whole business of conversation is really interesting, because I was speaking to a friend of mine from university who'd worked for Exxon. Mm-hmm. And he retired there, and he went to those, they have the equivalent retirement lectures, and they were talking about what's the best way of fending off, Alzheimer's and general, mental deterioration. And people would say, Sudoku or chess or something, but no, the most important thing is conversation. The fact that what the other person says, stimulates you to come up with something. The mere fact that you asked me a few sort of seemingly obvious questions, stimulates this, forgive me, this stream of consciousness, you know what I mean?
But that's exactly what I wanted, so I'm fine.
Just a nowhere boy from another nowhere town.
You will have noticed that I really enjoy talking to Alex. I don't usually include my side of the interview in my episodes anymore. In this case, however, it seemed like a good fit. Yeah. And also, I set up my audio recorder incorrectly, but that's another story. Pour la petite histoire, as Alex would say, he was there when I went on my very first interpreting trip abroad, what we in SCIC call a mission. The trip was to Reggio Emilia, and I remember thinking, wow, what interesting characters they have in this interpreting service.
All that I do it in love's name.
By the way, the music extracts throughout this episode are from two bands that Alexander's been involved in. About Time, and their album Songs from the Underground, and folk band Bahorn. Their album is called Binary, and the other band members and fellow SCIC interpreters are Elise Doherty, Jane McBride, and Andy Upton.
When you are chosen.
If you've enjoyed listening to this episode, please spread the word. I'd love for you to recommend the podcast to anyone and everyone you think might be interested. The podcast website is www.langfm.audio, and there's also a Twitter account @langfmpod. Do say hi, and until then, goodbye.